Well, good morning. Welcome to the Morning Report. My name is Willie Lawson. For most Americans, election laws are something that operate quietly in the background. People show up to vote, they cast a ballot, the system works. But every so often, a debate arises that forces the country to re examine the architecture of the democratic system itself. The current debate is over the SAVE Act, and that's short for Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. And this is one of those moments. Supporters of this legislation argue that it addresses a simple principle. Only citizens should vote in federal elections. And the system should verify that requirement rather than to rely on this you know, proclamation or declaration. Critics argue the bill could create new barriers for eligible voters. But beneath the daily headlines and political talking points lies a deeper story about how elections actually function here in the US. To understand why the SAVE Act has become such a flashpoint, you got to understand three structural pillars of American elections: election integrity, representation shaped by the census, and the integrity of voter rolls themselves. When these three pillars align, the system functions smoothly and the public trust is very high. But when they drift apart, political conflict grows and the legitimacy of elections can come into question. Okay. The current debate is not simply about paperwork requirements. It is about whether those three pillars still support the same democratic structure that they were designed to hold up. Now, the first pillar is the most straightforward federal law states that only US citizens may vote in federal elections. That's it. Only US citizens can vote in federal elections. This requirement existed for generations and is broadly accepted across the political spectrum. Voting is considered one of the core privileges of citizenship, tied directly to participation in the political life of a nation. Currently, most voter registration systems rely on the honor-based declaration. So when someone registers to vote, they check a box affirming that they are a US citizen and sign the form under penalty of perjury. So in theory, falsely claiming citizenship to vote is already illegal. But supporters of the SAVE Act argue that relying on a declaration alone is not sufficient in a modern election system. Their position is that the law should require verification rather than simple accepting a statement on a form. The proposed legislation would require documentary proof of citizenship, such as a passport, birth certificate, or some other qualifying documents, when registering to vote in federal elections. Now, from the perspective of the bill's supporters, this approach mirrors the logic used in many other parts of government. When applying for a passport, accessing federal benefits, or completing immigration paperwork, individuals must present documentation verifying their identity and their status. Voting, they argue, should be treated with the same seriousness. Critics counter that documentation cases of non-citizens are rare and that adding documentation requirements could create obstacles for some eligible voters. But supporters emphasize a preventative argument. The purpose of verification is not simply to catch wrongdoing after it occurs, but to prevent vulnerabilities in the system before they become problems. So in other words, the first pillar of the debate is built on a simple question: should citizenship eligibility for voting be verified directly? Or should the system continue to rely primarily on personal declaration backed by penalties for fraud? This sits at the center of the SAVE Act. All right. The second pillar is less obvious, but is arguably more significant. It may be a bigger deal. Let's talk about it. It involves the United States Census and the way representation in Congress is allotted. You know that every 10 years, the census counts the population of the country. The count determines how many seats each state receives in the House of Representatives and how electoral college votes are distributed in the presidential election. The census also influences the allocation of hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funding. Importantly, the census counts all residents, not just citizens. Did you know that? Did you know that the census counts everybody, not just citizens? Well, this includes citizens, permanent residents, temporary visa holders, and undocumented immigrants, illegal aliens living in the country. That method of counting has long been accepted as the standard approach for representation. Members of Congress represent everyone living in their district, not only the ones that are eligible to vote. However, the distinction between population counts and voting eligibility can create complex political dynamics. In areas with large numbers of non-citizens, congressional districts may contain fewer eligible voters relative to their population. This can influence how representation functions across the country. Some analysts argue that this arrangement can produce differences in voting power between districts. A district with a large non-citizen population may have fewer eligible voters selecting its representative compared to a district where nearly everybody counted in a census is eligible to vote. Supporters of the SAVE Act often connect this reality to the broader issue of election eligibility. The argument is that if the census counts everyone for purposes of representation, the election system must at least ensure that voting itself is restricted to citizens. From this perspective, legislation does not attempt to change how the census counts residents. Instead, it reinforces the boundary between representation and voter eligibility. Population counts may determine representation, but citizenship determines who participates in elections. And the critics will respond that representation has always been based on population rather than citizenship status. They argue that the elected officials serve all residents in their communities, including children, immigrants, and others who cannot vote. The difference is that children of citizens are citizens and are potential voters. Illegal aliens are not. And I know that that's a bit of turbulence that some Republicans don't want, like Senator Thune. This debate touches on a deeper philosophical question about American democracy. Should political representation be tied primarily to population or eligible voters? We need to have that discussion. The SAVE Act operates with that tension, strengthening the citizenship requirement on the voting side of the equation without altering the census framework itself, which, in my opinion, also needs to be altered. All right, the third pillar of the debate is often overlooked, but crucial to understanding the urgency behind the legislation. It concerns the accuracy and the maintenance of our voter registration databases. The United States does not operate a single national voter registry. Instead, voter rolls are maintained by thousands of state and local jurisdictions. Each state has its own procedures for registering voters, maintaining lists or not maintaining lists, and updating records. Over time, the voter rolls naturally accumulate inaccuracies. People move from one state to another, people pass away, people change their names due to marriage or the legal processes, administrative errors occur. Studies have periodically shown that voter registration databases contain outdated and or inaccurate entries, most often because voters have moved or records have not been updated. Election administrations spend considerable effort in maintaining and cleaning these lists, especially here in Florida. The SAVE Act addresses this issue indirectly by focusing on the front end of the registration process, by requiring documentary proof of citizenship at the time of registration. The bill aims to ensure that the voter rolls begin with verified eligibility. Now, it makes sense, right? Instead of having to go backward to the process and sift through the voter rolls to find out if people are eligible or not, if you require documentary proof in the beginning of the process, at the start of the process, you get a lot less of that. Will people slip through the cracks? Of course they will. Will people intentionally commit fraud to slip through the cracks? Of course they will. Because why? Because we say this in my house every day. People suck. There you go. So of course they will. But if you can stop most of it in the beginning from it happening, then things are better. Okay. The third pillar, therefore, centers on a practical administrative question. Should eligibility be verified more rigorously at the moment of registration to reduce long-term maintenance challenges? My answer is yes. The advocates of the SAVE Act believe the answer is yes as well. All right. Now, each of these pillars, citizenship verification, census-based representation, and voter roll integrity, exist independently within the American election system. But the current debate over the SAVE Act brings them together in a way that's really occurred before. The legislation attempts to align these elements into a coherent structure. First, it reinforces the citizen requirement for voting through documentation rather than declarations alone. Second, it clarifies the distinction between representation based on population and voting eligibility based on citizenship. Third, it aims to strengthen the administrative foundation of voter registration databases. I mean, you would think that every supervisor of election office in the country will be saying, yes, this would make our job so much easier. And it would, it would make the public trust go up so much higher because all the stuff that people talk about will be handled on the front end before it got to the supervisor of elections office, right? You'd think so. So together, these elements form a broader argument about how election systems should operate in a modern democracy. Supporters of the legislation see it as a preventative measure designed to preserve public confidence in our elections. Of course, critics see it as an unnecessary intervention that can complicate the voting process. The disagreement reflects different priorities: security and verification on one side, access and convenience on the other. Now, the timing of this debate matters too. The United States is already approaching the next major population count in 2030, 4 years away, which will again reshape congressional representation and the electoral college. Population shifts between states have been accelerating due to migration patterns, economic changes, demographic trends. States gaining population will gain representation. I think like Florida. I think Florida is due to add at least 2 more districts, and I think we're going to go from 29 to 31 probably. Now I have to check that out. Now you can fact check me on that if you want to, because I'm not quite sure about that. But from what we've been experiencing since COVID, I think that we're going to gain representation. It's slowed since then, but I still think we're going to gain. Election rules adopted in the years leading up to the next census will shape how those political changes unfold. Supporters of the SAVE Act argue that strengthening voter eligibility verification will ensure that the election system remains stable during the next decade of political realignment. In other words, the legislation is not about this coming election. It's about the next 10 years of election, and maybe even farther. Because ultimately, the debate surrounding the SAVE Act may be less about technical policy details and more about public confidence in democratic institutions. Modern election systems must satisfy two conditions. They must be secure and they must be perceived as secure by the public. If voters lose confidence in the fairness of elections, the legitimacy of democratic outcomes can and will be questioned, even when the underlying processes may be sound. Supporters of the SAVE Act argue that requiring proof of citizenship strengthens both security and the perception. Critics argue that the existing system already protects against fraud, and that additional requirement could create new complications. Everybody says that they're defending the integrity of American democracy. This disagreement lies in how the integrity is best protected. Yeah. At its core, the debate over the SAVE Act raises a fundamental question about the nature of democratic participation in America. Who should be allowed to vote? And how should the system verify that eligibility? The Constitution establishes the basic framework for elections, but leaves the details to Congress and the states. As the country grows larger and more complex, the administrative systems that support elections must evolve to keep pace. The SAVE Act represents one proposed evolution. Whether it is ultimately becomes law will depend on political negotiations, public opinion, and the legislative process in Congress. Now, the polls that have been done about this is that America, the United States, across the political spectrum, is for this sort of legislation. But regardless of the outcome, the debate itself reveals something important about the current moment in American politics. The mechanics of democracy, the census, voter registration systems, and election administration are no longer quiet technical matters handled behind the scenes. They have become the central topics of national discussion. And that discussion reflects a deeper concern shared by many Americans across the political spectrum, ensuring that the democratic system remain both fair and trusted in the years ahead. Now, in closing, the SAVE Act is not simply another election bill moving through Congress. It sits at the intersection of three foundational elements of American democracy: the citizenship requirement for voting in federal elections, the population counts that determine representation, and the administrative system that maintains the voter registration. When these three elements operate in harmony, elections proceed with confidence and legitimacy. When they drift apart, political controversy grows. The current debate is therefore about more than a single piece of legislation. It's about how the United States balances access, security, and trust in its democratic institutions. So whether the SAVE Act ultimately passes or not, the question it still raises will continue to shape our election policies for years and years to come. Tell me what you think in the comments. My name is William Lawson. Until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sakes, y'all take care of yourself. We will see you when we see you. Bye now.